Overlooking the city of Edinburgh in Scotland is an ancient volcano, now extinct. Arthur's Seat, most likely named after King Arthur, has inspired legends for hundreds of years. One story goes that the hill is actually a slumbering dragon. Another places it as the site of King David I's miraculous encounter with a white stag, whose antlers transformed into a cross before it could impale the king. David then chose to establish Holyrood Abbey on the base of Arthur's Seat. Centuries later, 3 Scottish boys were playing on the hill, hunting for rabbits, when they encountered something odd. 17 miniature coffins, neatly carved, with little figurines inside. Were these ancient relics? Fairy offerings? Or something far more sinister? I'm Nicole Miras, and this is Fireside Fables. Our story takes us to July of 1836, 1 year before Victoria would become Queen of Britain. Edinburgh was an evolving city, with the affluent residing in the Georgian New Town. Think elegant boulevards, neoclassical architecture, and the poor residing in tenement housing, often in squalid conditions. Edinburgh's Old Town today is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, renowned for its medieval and Renaissance architecture. But on the eve of the Victorian period, the Old Town really did embody many of the problems facing the urban poor, for whom death and disease was often just around the corner. And on that lighthearted note, subscribe to Fireside Fables. Okay, of course that context matters, and we'll soon see how that backdrop of urban challenges played a role in the story of the fairy coffins, and the folklore that would spring from their discovery. But before we get into all of that, I do want to thank you for watching, and if you are new here, Fireside Fables is still a pretty new channel on YouTube. So if you're interested in folklore, fairy tales, and ghost stories, subscribing to the channel makes a big difference and is much appreciated. Today, I am armed with a glorious cup of rooibos. Let's get into it. On July 20th, 1836, Charles Fort for the London Times reported on the strange discovery on Arthur's Seat. That early in July 1836, some boys were searching for rabbit's burrows in the rocky formation near Edinburgh known as Arthur's Seat. In the side of a cliff, they came upon some thin sheets of slate, which they pulled out. Little cave, 17 tiny coffins, 3 or 4 inches long. In the coffins were miniature wooden figures. They were dressed differently in both style and material. There were 2 tiers of 8 coffins each, and a third one begun with 1 coffin. The extraordinary datum, which has especially made mystery here, that the coffins had been deposited singly in the little cave and at intervals of many years. In the first tier, the coffins were quite decayed and the wrappings had moldered away. In the second tier, the effects of age had not advanced so far, and the top coffin was quite recent looking. Another report from the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland claimed that one of the slates that closed the small cave, and by cave I think we really mean hole, was rudely shaped like the headstone of a grave. They described them as Lilliputian coffins, in reference to Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, in which the protagonist encounters a race of tiny, pixie-like people on the island of Lilliput. Some news outlets described it as a fairy burial. In The Scotsman, a reporter noted that the boys destroyed many of the coffins as they were playing with them. Oddly enough, we've never learned who these boys were. Somehow, the 8 surviving coffins ended up in the hands of Robert Fraser, a local jeweler. How he obtained them is unclear, but in 1845, he sold them for £4, which today would be about £424. From there, they passed through private hands before eventually reaching a woman named Christina Cooper. And in 1901, she donated the 8 remaining coffins and their contents to the National Museum of Scotland. As the London Times reported, the coffins were initially found in various states of decay. Researchers have since concluded, after analyzing the coffins, that the burial most likely took place in the 1830s, just a few years before their discovery. However, there is the possibility that they weren't all buried at once, and today they remain part of the collection of the National Museum of Scotland. Okay, so we have a set of very creepy-looking dolls buried in a folklorically significant location. Who put them there? And what purpose did they serve? When the coffins were first discovered, the original theories surrounding their purpose was that they were meant for ritual magic. or that they were mimicked burials for sailors lost at sea. All of the figurines were dressed in pants, which would have been men's clothing at the time. A 1994 study of the coffins by historians Alan Simpson and Samuel Menifee, which I'll link below in the description if you're interested, highlights the use of applied pieces of tinned iron to decorate the coffins, suggesting that they may have been made by a shoemaker or a leather worker. Some of the dolls had their arms removed to fit into the coffins, and all of them had open eyes. Therefore, it's likely that the dolls were not carved for the purpose of the burials, but were part of a pre-existing set of toys and adapted later for this mysterious use. Simpson and Menifee dated the dolls specifically to the 1790s, though the burial was, as I said earlier, likely conducted in the 1830s. While previous writers debated the motivation for the burial, some sort of ritual, perhaps, Simpson and Menifee argued that it would be more productive to instead focus on an event that could have prompted the burials instead. In their words, if the burials were event-driven, by, say, the loss of a ship with 17 fatalities during the period in question, the speculation would at least be built on demonstrable fact. Stated another way, what we seek is an Edinburgh-related event or events involving 17 deaths, which occurred close to 1830 and certainly before 1836. One obvious answer springs to mind: the Westport Murders by William Burke and William Hare in 1827 and 1828. At the beginning of this episode, we talked about the gruesome conditions in which Edinburgh's working class lived. Now, violent crime didn't necessarily increase. Homicide rates were actually much higher all throughout the early modern period in Europe than they were in the 19th century, with this transformation occurring thanks to what historians sometimes call civilizing processes: better administration and law enforcement, legal avenues to resolve conflicts, and a reduction of a medieval honor culture that leads to duels and community violence. However, and this will sound familiar to many of you today, urbanization concentrates lots of people in one place, meaning that if a murder occurred in a tenement building in Old Town, far more people were likely to hear about it compared to a village miles and miles away. Additionally, something we've talked about in several episodes on this show is the seismic impact of the Industrial Revolution, particularly in regards to the flow of information. Daily newspapers, which could now be printed cheaply and accessible to a much wider share of the population, reported every scandal fit to print. If it bleeds, it leads. And just a few years before the discovery of the fairy coffins, the ultimate gory news story shocked Edinburgh. As Simpson and Menifee point out in their research, the Burke and Hare murders. During the late 18th and early 19th century, medicine and surgical practices were advancing rapidly, but the only legal option for obtaining cadavers for scientific study were the bodies of executed criminals. This led to a rise in grave robbing and body snatching, in which impoverished people would dig up the bodies of the recently deceased and sell them to doctors. Donating your body to science wasn't an acceptable practice, as it flew in the face of the period's religious taboos. Actual Christian theology is more complex, and biblical scholars debated what resurrection would really look like in the end times. But for ordinary people, they understood this literally. Bodies of the dead are buried in the ground, and bodies would literally rise out of the dirt on Judgment Day. So body snatching to them wasn't just disrespectful, it was a catastrophic assault. And this is why body snatchers were called resurrection men. But Burke and Hare took this a step further. They didn't just snatch the bodies of individuals who had already died. They murdered people and sold their corpses to the anatomist Robert Knox. There were 16 confirmed murders, with the possibility of a 17th. An unknown victim whom Burke and Hare claimed to have sold after he had already died, though it's very much possible that this 17th person was a murder victim as well. The others were a mix of men and women and one child. They were all poor, often transient workers, laborers, sex workers, and in the case of Jamie Wilson, intellectually disabled. The murders horrified the public, and William Burke was executed. William Hare received immunity in exchange for testifying against Burke. Knox escaped persecution due to lack of clear evidence that he knew the victims had been murdered. Although, given that he was an anatomist, it's highly likely that he knew. After all, these victims were, for lack of a better word, delivered fresh. It's possible that the 17 fairy coffins represented Burke and Hare's 17 victims, a burial for those who never received a proper one. It's not definitive, of course. The 17 dolls were all male, and Burke and Hare murdered several women. However, as the dolls were part of a pre-existing set, it may have been what the owner had on hand. We'll never know if the 17 coffins were indeed the 17 victims, but it highlights the importance of burial for the people who lived at the time. Whatever the fairy coffins were intended to be, they speak to a deep human need to give proper form to grief when the dead are uncounted and unremembered. In a city where the poor were vanishing without ceremony, even a small coffin might have seemed like an act of mercy. The fairy coffins may never tell us who made them or why, but they remind us that folklore doesn't appear out of nowhere. These enduring stories of fear and imagination always have the human spirit at their center. Thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in folklore and weird stories from history, please consider subscribing and maybe even share it with a friend or two. I share new episodes every week. Be well, and I'll see you next time.